Well, this is Jessica Powers with the Mother of All Things Substack and from Catalyst Press, Flare Books, and Power Squared. And I am here with Lee Byrd, formerly of Cinco Puntos Press. Lee and I have known each other for,
Oh,
a couple decades plus since I started working for Cinco Puntos in 2002, January of 2002.
that's right.
And we had a very long history. You published a couple of my books as well. So we've been around the block a few times.
Yes, we have. We have indeed. Yep.
So thank you for chatting with me. And this can be, relatively informal. The people who watch it will be interested in publishing, interested in you, and interested in the larger world of books. So without any other introduction, tell me a little bit about how you and your husband, Bobby Byrd, launched Cinco Puntos many, many years ago, and like how that all happened and why.
It was 35 years ago, I think. You know, we sold it in 2021, so that was 35 years from back then.
So it's been
Um,
almost 40 years now.
yeah, yeah. Well, we started it when we went out to California and we met up with a guy named Richard Grassinger and his wife, Lindy Howe. And they were publishers of Bobby's book, and they told us that they were making $25,000 a year as publishers. And we thought, well, we could do that because we were right at that moment in time. Bobby was working at Fort Bliss as a tech writer. Our sons had been in an accident, and our life was reshaping, and we were tired of the work that we'd been doing. So we decided that we would begin publishing, and we really did not have any idea what it was that meant. What did that mean? And a lot of people we'll say, oh, we're a publisher, and oh, that's great, and they have no idea what we're talking about, or they'll say, I have a manuscript. They come at it in different ways, but we 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 started Cinco Puntos shortly after that because we had a book, and the book was by a man named Dagoberto Gilb, who was a friend. He'd won a big award in California, and people had said New York publishers will be ready to pick you up, but New York publishers weren't ready to pick him up because the 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 rising of Chicano writers had not occurred yet. It was back in 80, 81, 82, and Latino writers were not being sought after. And so Dagoberto's book, Winners on the Pass Line, we published it. We had a friend down the street, Vicky Hill, who knew how to design a book. And when the book came out, we didn't have an address in the phone book. We didn't have a phone number. It got reviewed on NPR, and nobody knew how to buy it. It was kind of amazing how it started, but
It's amazing that, okay, so two things. I mean, first of all, it's amazing that it got reviewed on NPR. And Philip Lee said, had a similar story when I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago that their very first book that they published at Lee and Low got a full page spread in the New York Times. And he said that's never happened since,
you wish it would happen, huh?
like beginner's luck or something.
Yeah,
But
yeah. We
And then the
didn't.
other thing was that, you haven't talked about how you're in El Paso, and so publishing a Mexican American writer seemed kind of
Oh,
natural
yeah,
to you.
there's a bunch of history to catch up on. So Bobby and I moved to El Paso, Texas in 1978, and everything about this culture was totally engaging and interesting to us. And so when we started publishing, well, not right away, but we knew Dagoberto Gilb as a friend, so we were delighted that he allowed us to publish his book. Did we know at all what that even meant, publishing his book? But nonetheless, we did it. We didn't have any distributorship. We didn't know how you distributed a book. We didn't have any sense of that.
How
But
to
we
get it into bookstores, how to have
bookstore, even like
libraries
that.
buy it.
Yeah, we didn't understand that at all. So when we came up with this book, Bobby and I, when we started Cinco Puntos, we thought, well, Bobby's a poet and I'm a fiction writer. We'll publish fiction and poetry. well, we only had this one book by Dagoberto Gilb, and so we I forget how that went. We put it out there, and it probably didn't sell too well. And Dagoberto was disappointed. He thought maybe it would take off, but we did not have the apparatus in place or the distributorship or any of that. But yes, that's real important that what we began to look for, but not at first, was the culture here on the border and writers from the border. But that didn't happen at first. At first, we published poets that we knew, friends whose books we knew, Joe Somoza, Keith Wilson, and then we met Joe Hayes. So it's coming along here. This is where, when we met Joe Hayes, when Bobby first heard, Joe Hayes is a storyteller. He's from Benson, Arizona. He lived in Santa Fe, and Bobby and he met they were both doing, Bobby was doing poetry in the schools and Joe Hayes was doing storytelling in the schools. And Bobby heard Joe Hayes tell a story and he was like, this is amazing. This is amazing. And I think Joe was making $25 a day. So Bobby went to the council and said, and living in his car, it was really economizing. And Bobby said, you should be making more. And he spoke to the New Mexico Arts Council, I think, about that. And so Joe began his career, not because of Bobby, but he just began to make more money. But we asked Joe, can we publish a book of yours? And he said, yeah, it has to be La Llorona, the ghost story that every kid loves, and it has to be in Spanish and English. So not knowing anything else, even too much about the story La Llorona or the bilingual world out there, we published that book, and that book became probably our best-selling book.
And you guys always called Cinco Puntos the house that La Llorona built, right?
Yeah, because it was that book that was the foundational book, and that book took us kind of far away from that goal of publishing fiction and poetry to where we saw not the huge market, but the need for bilingual books for kids. So we switched. We started publishing bilingual books for kids. El Cucuy, La Llorona, books by Benjamin Hilary Sainz, A Gift from Papa Diego, all in Spanish and English, and all coming out of the culture, not retellings of American classics in Spanish, but stories that came from the culture. And we started looking for those. We had this, not active, but that's what caught our eye, was the culture on the border.
What's interesting, of course, is you saw the need for it, but there really wasn't a market for it much at the time,
There
right?
wasn't there wasn't a market, and there wasn't a market. And I think about that time, we came on with a national distributor consortium that
Mm-hmm.
you are with, and when we tried to sell our bilingual books to our sales reps, when we tried to pitch them, they were kind of like, well, who's going to buy those books? The guys in the warehouse, are they going to buy those books? They did not understand this market that was kind of this, what did Susie used to say, 33 million Latinos in the US who are willing to buy books, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a huge market. And the sales reps didn't quite understand it. They are wonderful sales reps, but they did not get that point of view. So we had
Not
a
at
little bit.
first, right? But later,
Yeah,
I think there was a greater understanding of, oh my gosh, these books are doing well. But they didn't always do well in the bookstores, right? It was more libraries and schools that really picked up on the need. And um,
right. Or places like there was a place in California called Family Literacy, and they would buy like 200 of Ben's books at once and pass them out to families. And so there was a lot going on. Meanwhile, Mexican people were moving from the border over into, like, say, South Carolina, where there were factories that they could work in, or to New Jersey, up north, and we were seeing our markets shift, and the sales reps beginning to see, oh, there's a market. So there was this whole thing going on that we didn't really understand at the time. We just liked those bilingual books, and people liked them, so we kept producing them.
And then you kind of branched out. You were still publishing adult books while you were publishing these children's books.
Not a lot, some. I'm maybe you're remembering something else.
No, 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 no. I
I
know
think we
they
kind
would
of just kind of
never there were never as many adult books as there
yeah,
were, but at the
kids.
same time, you were still publishing some adult books, and you started to recognize a niche market there as well that was a little different than your original vision, correct?
Niche market was what you introduced us to, which was young adult books. And then from there, we went to middle grade books, which is a whole nother wonderful market. Both those markets, I don't even want to say markets, both those groups of people, because we didn't think of it as a market. We just thought, oh, young adults, the librarians and the teachers that supported young adult literature were crazy, just crazy, nutty, willing to dress up, willing to hire, have people come in and talk, well, wanting these books to get in front of kids. And then we started to see that middle grade books had the same effect. So how did we get there? Well, you said you should do a young adult book. So we did the book by the two books by the Abraham sisters, and then Ben Sines had young adult books. Claudia Martinez had a middle grade book, The Smell of Old Lady Perfume. Um, Lots of wonderful books, and in the middle of all that, um, my eye began to be on the voices that were coming out in that young adult literature and the middle grade books. My sensibilities was like, oh, this is way more interesting than writers from back east or from California. Well, California maybe. Um, so that was how we developed. We developed, and we also in the middle of that did a lot of books about socially active books, like Si Se Puede, a bilingual book about the janitor strike in LA, C'est la vie, a book that was only in English by Yumi Landau about um, the Haitian children growing up and what was happening there. Just a lot of books that spread us out, but that totally interested us. So that's what we never sat around and thought, well, will this sell? We just kept doing stuff that we really liked.
And it's just interesting. How do you think that your eye developed in this way? Like you're from New Jersey.
Yeah,
You ended up in El Paso by kind of a fluke, really.
yeah,
Um, and your eye developed both towards a very strong taste in publishing books that related to the US Mexico border, particularly for kids and for young adults, but for adults too, and
right,
Southwest.
yeah,
But you kind of branched beyond that really to be one of the first presses or that published multicultural or diverse books for children and young adults. And so you really branched beyond the US Mexico border, beyond Latino writers, to kind of, Sonia Patel and other writers that you published that were debut writers of color.
yeah.
That how did and I know you used to always say to me that one of the things you really loved when a manuscript came in and it opened a world to you that you didn't know anything about.
Right.
But how did that develop as an interest for you? Like, um,
I can sort of remember, I don't know, but long ago, before we were ever publishers, I remember reading a book by Maxine Hong Kingston called The Warrior Woman. And she opened it up with a baby being born in a field in China, I guess, and then brought it into a supermarket in San Francisco where the ladies screamed at each other across the aisles because that's how they called each other in the field. And all this was so totally foreign to me. I was like, why have I been reading all these books by white writers that where I understood everything? I want to read about other people. And so yes, that was my first memory of wanting to be like that. And then when I would get a manuscript and I would hear a voice, That's what I, a voice that was genuine, that was interesting, that was engaging, that called to me. I think that's, and then we started also doing Native American writers, Marcy Rendon, a Ojibwe writer, Murder on the Red River. Just, it's just amazing how all that came together without us really planning it, like sitting down and saying, let's have a business plan. Let's just publish multicultural writers. Well, if it came,
This is our mission statement.
this is our mission. We didn't have,
None of us ever had a mission statement, did
we
you?
never had a mission statement. I still remember when Gabby, A Girl in Pieces by Isabel Quintero came in the door, and she said that she had sent it to me before. I have no memory of that. I think I read the first three paragraphs and went, oh, or John Byrd did. I don't know. We just went, oh, and that was just a really good start. And that book by David Bowles, They Call Me Huero, which was, it hit a note at a certain time in the development of Latino literature, where now so many of those writers have, the big houses understand what they can provide, what they're doing, what they're opening up for people. And so they're now being published by much bigger houses with much more money, which is great.
Yeah, no, it's I have the same experience with some of
Actually,
my writers that have gone on to, bigger publishing houses and much bigger, uh, much,
advances.
much bigger. Yeah, a lot more money.
Good
And
for them.
that's, I mean, it's gratifying to realize, well, okay, I recognize something early and other
Yeah,
people now see the value and move on. But those early days were hard.
they were
And
hard. But you know what? A book I just remembered, they were hard. Remember that book we did, Vatos?
uh-huh. Great.
Vatos, Vatos is a poem by Luis Alberto Urrea with photos by Jose Galvez. And Vicky designed it, our designer, just in black and white. The photos are black and white, and then the poetry on a couple lines. And kids love that book.
I love that book.
I love that book, and when it first came out, we didn't quite know what to do with it. And then it won some big young adult, not big, but it got recognized as a young adult book. I think Linda Rivera, a librarian from here, recognized it. And when it got recognized, she was on that committee. She said she started to cry because she sort of got where it was going. It was going in this direction. It was honoring Latino men in a way that was different in all their variations. So, yes, but in the beginning it was hard because we didn't know what we were doing and we didn't know how to make money. We weren't good business people.
I think you probably would say that you remained never quite knowing how to make money,
That
but you
could,
published great books.
good. I think that's when you asked before, what did you do? I think our legacy is that we published really wonderful books
Hmm.
that 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 can stand the test of time if Lee and Low we were bought by Lee and Low. If Lee and Low continues to publish them, and I think they will, but I think they're really good books.
Yeah, I think those books have stood the test of time, and it's a testament to the longevity of them that Lee and Low did buy them and are keeping them in print. And um, you had this real breakthrough moment. I believe it was in 1999 when you had a grant by the NEA that was rescinded for a book,
Yeah,
Story of Colors,
yeah,
right?
right.
That was a real breakthrough moment for the press, wasn't it?
Because we were still working in the house. In fact, our office was right here in this office. Susie and Eddie worked for us, and they came over every day from next door. We all worked in the house, and Bobby had gone to Guadalajara. I think one of our friends, Patsy Aldana of Groundwood Press, had said, "You have to go to these big book fairs and buy the rights to books. That's bring in books." This is what you know totally, Jessica. Bring in
You
books
guys
from
hardly ever did that, though. This was one of very few books that you ever bought the rights to. I think, yeah.
Uh, we bought two others that didn't do very well, but Bobby was down there and he wanted to buy The Story of Colors by Stu Comandante Marcos. And he did. He got the rights, and Marcos didn't have a copyright on it. He didn't want it to have a copyright. So we just bought the rights from the illustrator, Domi. And we bought that right and we published it. And we asked for a grant from the NEA. And the NEA gave us a grant without understanding who Subcomandante Marcos was. And on the eve of its publication, someone from the New York Times in Mexico asked Bobby about the book and why the NEA had given us a grant. And Bobby replied, "Oh, they're very liberal. They give grants to all these kind of off the wall books." And the next day, the NEA rescinded our grant, took away the grant. And it made the cover of the New York Times. And we must have sold 5,000 copies of the book right out of this room. People were, Susie had to go, Susie went next door and answered the phone. We answered the phone here. We got nonstop phone calls for like 3 or 4 days. And that was a big moment for us because we were recognized nationally, and that book had a lot of emotional pull for people. So that was an important book for us. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the first time I had ever heard of Cinco Puntos. I wasn't even living in El Paso. I mean, I had gotten my Master of Fine Arts from the University of Texas, El Paso. I graduated in 1999. I had never heard of Cinco Puntos by at that point in time. I mean, I knew who Joe Hayes was because growing
Yeah.
up in El Paso, he would come and do storytelling at the border. Let's see, there was a
Folk
border
festival.
folk festival.
Yep.
And so I
Yep.
grew up hearing him, and my brother, my older brother, remembers actually when we lived in Albuquerque having Joe come and tell stories at our school there. So I did know about Joe Hayes, but I didn't know the books. And you probably hadn't published very many Joe Hayes books in 1999 anyway, maybe a few.
Your mother and father came over to talk to me about publishing on the day when all these big TV stations were coming in the front door to interview Bobby. And we went in the back room, and this guy, John Ross, was here. This guy from Mexico, the writer from Mexico. It was crazy. And he kept saying, "Bob, this is big. This is big. All these news stations are going to." We were so excited. It was really a big moment for us.
Well, I still hadn't
Mother,
heard.
mother had heard, your mother heard about us. Well, your mother must have known, but then you came over to visit. Just
Yes, but that happened later. So had moved to New York and I was in graduate school in New York in African history, which has nothing to do with Subcomandante Marcos. But I took an anthropology class, and the professor and all of the grad students in the class were um, focused on central Mexico Mexico and Mexican anthropology. And I wasn't, but as a result, I was reading the books of the class, and that was one of the books on the list. This was fall of 1999.
interesting.
And that was the first I'd heard of Cinco Puntos. And yeah, I came and visited you on a visit home. My mom brought me over and I met with you guys, but I still didn't really understand. I just didn't, I was a writer, but I didn't understand much about publishing. I've been
That
in
that's
publishing since 2002, and I still wonder how much I understand about publishing.
that's the interesting thing is so many writers. Bobby was always saying at the graduate schools there need to be courses in publishing so a writer could understand that process and how much work goes into it.
Yeah,
Because
it's a real mystery.
it is a mystery, yeah. And
Yeah.
it's a mystery for us publishers because you put all this money into a book and you have no idea if it's going to make it back. And if it does make it back, sometimes it's overwhelming because you don't know how to handle it.
Well, if most of your books, and I mean, I think this is true, I mean, we're not talking about the big publishers here, but it's still true with big publishers where most books don't make the money back. But they expect, one or two books to really carry the day
Yeah.
and sell well, but they still have to keep this grand publishing program. But for smaller publishers, you're going along and you're creating these books. And for the most part, they're not, none of them are, you know, going viral, to use modern terminology. And so, you're selling a few hundred or maybe 1,000 or so, and you can handle that. And the infrastructure that you've built can handle that. But all of a sudden, to have a big seller can be a real shock to a small
Because
publisher
you
because
don't have the money to
you don't
reprint
have
it.
the money to sell. I know I spoke with this Kenyan publisher, and one of their books unexpectedly got picked up as what they call a set book. And a set book in the Kenyan education system means that every single school child in certain grades, and for them it would have been like 4 to 6 different grades, had to buy the book, which we're talking about, 500,000 kids have to buy the book.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
huge.
it's huge, but where do you find the money to print 500,000 copies of a book?
Yeah,
And we don't quite have that system in the United States, but even so, if you suddenly have to print, if you're used to printing a few hundred copies or 1,000 copies at a time, and suddenly you have to print 10,000 copies overnight, finding the
the
cash for that.
the other side of that, though, is that the author whose book is breaking out is watching and wondering why the book is done. So you have this pressure. You have a pressure to reprint and to reprint fast, and then the author saying, it's not in the stores, it's not in the market. What's going on?" So it can be a real catch 22. It can
Yeah.
hurt.
Success is what you need and want, but
You're
success
not
comes
ready
with
for
an
it.
enormous number of headaches that make it hard to
Yeah,
keep it going. Yeah.
yeah. Well, we had two. We had well, La Llorona was manageable because we kind of grew with that one, but Gabby, A Girl in Pieces, and They Call Me Güero both just broke out completely, and it was hard for us to keep up with the printing on that.
Do you think, was there a reason why so as a publisher and authors, we're always wondering, is there some reason why some books are more successful than others? And is there something that's happening with the marketing? Is there something that's happening, that the author does? Is there something, and can you point to anything the story of Colors is sort of obvious what happened. There was a New York Times article, the NEA rescinded the grant. This got front page news. Like this is sort of a total fluke, right? Like there's nothing predictable about that. Gabby, A Girl in Pieces by Isabel Quintero and They Call Me Güero by David Bowles. Is there something um, predictable in why those books did as well as they did that publishers could replicate or that authors could replicate? Is there some sort of replicable action?
Well, both of them. I'll start with Gabby. Gabby won the Morris Award, which is the debut YA book award, and that comes with a lot of attention. But it was a book that came along. It was a moment in time when that book came out. Gabby was a kind of a fat girl. She liked to eat. There was no holds barred. Like she wasn't about to say, "Oh, I'm embarrassed. I eat too much." She just enjoyed eating.
There was no eating disorder involved. It
No,
was just, hey, I like to eat.
she was, and her family was a mess, and her relatives were a mess, and her, she was getting advice from the next generation up that was all the bad advice, like keep your legs crossed when you're around boys, and just stuff that was, but it was just that moment in time where girls were Latinas were wanting to hear about a girl who wasn't exactly movie star type.
Mhm.
And
This is what,
Isabel,
2013, I think? Did it come out?
something like that. It's already had a 10-year anniversary, yeah. And it's interesting. I think Lee and Lowe did a real nice podcast where Isabel was interviewed about the 10-year anniversary, and all she talked about was her insight about that book at that time, which sort of went over my head, but it was so refreshing to hear it. But it was this whole sense of herself as a young woman wanting to, I don't know. It's great if you can listen to it. It's a podcast from Lee and Low about Gabby, a Girl in Pieces. I just think it was a moment in time
You
that
know,
it was.
we'll get back to They Call Me Wedo and whether there's something replicable there, but what strikes me is your very humble admission that you never knew what you were doing and you didn't always understand why a book might be important. Like Gabby, a Girl in Pieces, it all was going over your head. You just recognized that you loved the voice, you loved the book, you ended up loving the author, and you were like, okay, we'll do it with no sense of what it might do or could do, and not, you know, not like, man, every girl in America should read this, whatever ethnic background they are, because they all need to understand um not to be shamed about their bodies or whatever. Like that sounds so preachy, and all of that preachy stuff always just kind of, it sounds like always went over your head anyway.
A lot of it went over my head. A lot, and I think that's been why we were so successful. We almost had no idea what we were doing, but we were. Remember when she won that award? You and I were there. Um,
In Chicago, it was a very snowy night.
Very snowy, and
Everything was closed down because, there was a blizzard and nobody was going out to eat or whatever, but we had this dinner with the Morris librarians. We didn't know if we'd won it yet.
no. But
And
when she walked out the door to into the taxi, they called her and said, "You won," and we all just sat there, just like we were so
you
excited.
were
And
screaming. There was
I
snow
was
like
shouting.
crazy. It was dark, a dark Chicago night with 3 or 4 feet of snow. And
So
you
excited.
actually were swearing. I'm not going to swear
I
on
was.
here, but you were
I was.
swearing.
Don't swear. But Isabel, the next day, she gave that stunning speech about why people would say to her something like, "Well, your parents were just workers, or I don't know what, factory workers. How did they raise a kid who was
To be
got a
who.
degree or something like that?" She just it was just such a perfect speech, and that book that it's still in print 10 years later, it really had a life. That was an important book for Isabel. Yeah, it's a great one.
And
I
for
hope
Cinco Puntos. Yeah.
she does some more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know her recent Poppy Has a Motorcycle picture book
Oh yeah, yeah.
has just won some award or is on some important, like almost win award or something.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what, but I did notice
Well,
that. So yeah,
and
it's really launched her career, which is great.
and, and the reason that David Bowles' book did well was it was poetry. Not it was without anybody noticing it was poetry. It's just that and then also it won every award in the world. I mean, it really did win a lot of young adult awards. And maybe it was They Call Me Güero. It was a white looking kid who wasn't white, who was Hispanic. I don't know. It struck some chord and it was middle grade. That I think that was it. If it had been notched up to young adult, maybe it wouldn't have done so well. But it was a middle grade book.
Yeah, it's interesting how these trends work because for a while there, middle grade was, doing really
Hot.
well, and David Bowles' book hit the middle grade market at a time when middle grade was selling really well. And in the last year or two, middle grade sales have kind of tanked.
Huh.
Um, and so it's sort of interesting how you can't necessarily predict these things. I know when I told you to start publishing young adult fiction, young adult was in that upward rise, right? It hadn't reached the level of popularity that it reached in the decade after that, in the 2 decades after that, right? It was starting the rise, but it hadn't yet reached the level of popularity. And I think then everybody started writing young adult books. You had all of these adult writers start writing young adult books because that was what was selling. And now we've got this hugely oversaturated YA market, and they still sell better than adult books, without a question. A book that comes out as a young adult sells better than an adult fiction book.
Oh, and then Ben Sines, an adult writer, when he brought us Sammy and Juliana, I think it was you that said, just put that voice of that old man into a teenager's voice, and that book was such a success.
Yeah, and it launched Ben into his young adult, hugely successful young adult writing career.
And he almost
Yeah,
doesn't write anything else but young adult. I
yeah.
don't, yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think he hasn't put out any books of poetry or any adult novels in a long time. But yeah, no, but I think now like the young adult sales have plateaued, middle grade has tanked. Like who knows what the next best thing is? I mean, there's these genres that suddenly become overnight seem to become really popular, like romantasy right now. Do you know what romantasy is?
No.
Could never have published a romantasy. It's romance plus fantasy.
Oh,
It's very
oh,
popular genre right now, selling like hotcakes. But it's the in thing right now. It's the flavor of the month. It won't last forever, but suddenly a lot of people are going to be publishing romantasy until
it dies out.
it dies out, and then but you can't predict, is the next thing going to be sci-fi? I guess the advice to writers is write what you love,
Right.
and you can't follow trends because they're unpredictable.
That's the main thing is write what you, yeah, because people, you have to write what you write, and then you have to look carefully for a publisher where there's a fit, if you can. I mean, it is still all mysterious and the luck of the draw a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, looking back on your many years in publishing, what was your favorite thing about publishing?
I think it was hearing a voice. It was hearing a voice. Like I think I remember when Marcy Rendon's book came in, she had been recommended to us by a librarian. You're going to remember her name. The Nambe Pueblo librarian. Oh, I can't remember it. Forgive me because I can't remember it. But Marcy had been recommended to us by a librarian whom we all respected, and the book wasn't even quite. It was sort of incomplete and disconnected and needed rewriting. But you could hear this very quiet, reserved voice in there. I think that's what my favorite thing is reading something and hearing a voice and being attracted and wanting to keep going and thinking, oh, this is something else. That's what I'd say was my favorite part.
Yeah, I think the editor at my other editor at my company for Rebota is in the same way. Like he hears a voice, and I've heard other editors say that. Um, I'm not sure what it is for me, but I just know when I love books. Or
Yeah, yeah.
so really your favorite part was finding books that you just loved. That
Well,
you,
and I also, yeah, I don't know if you remember that on the website it said you have to call Lee Byrd on the telephone.
I do
And so,
remember.
so people would call me on the phone, and my kids would mock me because they were wanting to do it like a podcast or something of all the phone calls that people said the goofiest things. So that was kind of fun to actually talk to people. But then if I would hear somebody tell me, you know, something that I was looking for, something I was really interested in, then I'd say, send it right away, send it.
Hmm.
And I
Well,
agree.
that was a really interesting part of your whole submission process that I don't think any other publisher has the bravery to do, where your requirement was call me up and pitch the book verbally before you. And I
Yeah,
think most publishers don't have the bravery to do that, for one thing, because they might feel inundated, but also because, for me, I grew up in the Southwest in El Paso, and I grew up as a Christian girl. And I have this tendency to just be overly nice and encouraging and want to and so I remember the funny thing about you was you're just your New Jersey East Coast self would come out in these things, and you were very blunt in these phone calls. You weren't inviting and nurturing and um like the things that I would be, and that I would have this tendency to be very inviting and nurturing. Oh, yes, it does. It sounds like potentially a very important book. You should, and then like all the while might be thinking, I don't want to read this, but I'd inevitably say something. I mean, I never took those phone calls. They were required to go to you. But like if I had this same submission policy of call me up and pitch me, I'd be like, yes, well, I mean, I have to see what the pages look like. I have to, see what the voice is and see whether there's interest, but please do send me. And everybody would inevitably send me. I would invite everybody to send it to me. Whereas you used it as this tactic for discouraging submissions. And
I did.
you had in this New Jersey voice, this, I mean, I guess your accent isn't peculiarly New Jersey, but in this East Coast kind of style, you'd say, "Well, have you read any of our books?" What? And if they said no, you'd just say, "Well, read some of our books and then call back." Or if they said yes, you'd say, okay, which of our books have you read? And why do you think your book would be a good fit for us based on the books that you've read?
Right.
And if they didn't have a good answer to that, you'd say, well, maybe you need to read more of our books and call back. Donk.
I
You're
wonder if
so like,
I'd say,
no nonsense.
I'd say, I'd say, you mean you want us to spend $10,000 in a year of our lives on your book, and you don't know what we do? That just irritated me that they didn't. They just wanted to get published. So, but yeah, that was a fun part. That was a lot of fun. My kids just mocked me on that. You did too. Clearly, you sat right next. It was fun.
Yeah. Um,
That's what I
well,
did.
so what was maybe your least favorite part of publishing, if I dare ask?
The meetings are terrible meetings.
Which terrible meetings? The ones where I took you to task, or
Oh,
ones where your children took you to
where we would
task?
all sit around the table and meet, and we'd make a list of. It was just hard to get us together. It's what it was, and it was because we. It was just we just weren't business people. Maybe that the meetings were hard. I think Bobby was really good at those conferences. I like the conferences because I like to sell books, but he really was good at, and you're really good at that, going out and, you know, networking with all the other publishers and talking to the librarians. That was really a good combination. Or like if you and I would go, you'd do that, and I would just, I just wanted to sell books. Yeah, I like to sell books. Yeah,
You should have been a book. Maybe you should have opened a bookstore.
I
Maybe
should have opened a bookstore. Yeah. Anyway, that's kind of that's my least favorite.
I've got a retirement plan for you now.
Oh no.
Now that you're retired, you need to open a bookstore. Actually, there is a bookstore in El Paso somewhere that they had all their books in there. It's somewhere in your neighborhood. It,
Bravo, is it Bravo Books?
I think so. Yeah, they just had all these books in there and they just sort of opened a bookstore.
There, it's used bookstores, and the guy's real nice. Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't been in it, but I've met him because he came and bought some books when we sold out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's close with if you have so I'll start my question with a little story, which you have heard, which is that when I thought I wanted to open my own publishing company, and I did go on to open my own publishing company, and I asked you and Bobby what I should, what your thoughts were for me about opening up my own or launching my own publishing company. And Bobby just had 3 words, and it was don't do it.
I have the same 3 words.
So is that your advice for any
Yeah,
wannabe
yeah,
publisher out
yeah.
there? Anybody who's thinking of doing it, your advice would be don't do it?
Well, no, because some people are really called, like you had a calling, you had a mission with the work from Africa, and you really felt that. Or you've branched all over the place. I think it would be hard to have stopped you from publishing. But sometimes we would say that to people who seemed like just starry-eyed about it. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, as you know, and often not rewarding work. It's just it's not it's
There's a lot of
rewarding.
drudgery. There's unhappy authors. There's
There's me
criticism from
bad authors.
reviewers, booksellers, librarians. There's, people who think you should be doing something. Like there's lots and lots of criticism all around the place. Yeah, it
There's that.
is. And then there's just the drudgery of
Right.
certain
Or
type of
then,
work.
but then a book wins an award which is an affirmation of, I don't know, it's an affirmation that you've done something that's recognized. And I think our books, they didn't win huge awards, but they won steady recognition from librarian committees and stuff. And that was really critical. That was so important. That made our day, our month, our year.
Yeah, I think that the Morris Award was probably the biggest award that Cinco Puntos ever won,
Yeah.
right?
And then Sonia Patel was a finalist for that the next year. So that was two recognitions. That was good, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but you haven't actually given the advice. What advice would you give to somebody who, not that they're starry-eyed, but that really does have a calling to do this? What would be the thing you would want to say to them?
Well, actually, oddly enough, I always thought you're gonna drive me nuts. I always thought that publishing would be a great homeschool business
Hmm.
because
Family business.
a family business, and if you're homeschooling, that would be your curriculum because there's so much as a part of it. And I don't, I just think it's a business that everybody in the house, if you're all kind of nerds and you're all into it, and it's a learning. There was so
Well,
much.
it covers everything. I mean, the aspects of business, accounting slash math. The books that you publish can cover science, history, politics,
Marketing is huge. Marketing a book is just such a,
marketing and sales, understanding, how people respond to things, advertising, and then just, proofreading and writing and
yeah,
editing.
every,
Yeah,
there's
it
all
covers
sorts of
everything.
aspects. So it is kind of a family business, maybe family of adults, but I don't know. I thought of that it would be something, it's a real learning. And
Yeah.
there's so many venerable small presses in the US that have done really, really good work. So it's just been important stuff.
Well, we'll close there. Thank you so much, Lee, for talking with me, and for talking about your long history in the book world.